night shift usually started the same way. I would unlock the ranger station a little before sunset, check the radio, grab the patrol log, and drive the main loop roads to make sure the last visitors were heading out before the gates closed. Most nights were quiet. Once the sun dropped behind the hills and the temperature started to fall, the park emptied out quickly. Families packed their coolers, hikers finished their trails, and the campground slowly went dark one by one. By around 9 o'clock, the entire place usually felt abandoned. That night was no different at first. I remember the air being unusually still. No wind, no distant traffic from the highway miles away. Just the low hum of the ranger truck engine and the occasional chirp of insects in the trees. The park officially closed at 8. By 9:30, I had already locked the front gate and driven through the main campground. Every site was empty except for one approved overnight camper who had already checked in with us earlier that afternoon. Everything seemed normal. I started heading toward the outer roads to finish the rest of my patrol. Those sections of the park were quieter and more remote. Most visitors never even made it that far in the daytime, and at night it was almost guaranteed to be completely empty. The road narrowed as it wound deeper into the forest. My headlights stretched out across the asphalt, lighting up the tall pine trees that stood close to the road on both sides. Every few hundred yards, there would be a small gravel pull-off or trailhead parking lot. Most of them only held 4 or 5 cars at most. I had just turned onto the service road that led toward one of the more isolated trails when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a reflection. Then my headlights shifted slightly as the road curved, and I saw it clearly. A pickup truck. It was parked alone in the gravel lot at the Cedar Ridge trailhead. I slowed down immediately. That trailhead was one of the last stops on my patrol route, and I was certain the lot had been empty earlier when I drove past it before closing the gate. The truck looked older, a dark-colored pickup with a slightly rusted tailgate and a small toolbox mounted behind the cab. The engine wasn't running, and the headlights were off, just sitting there in the middle of the lot. I pulled my Ranger vehicle onto the gravel and parked a short distance behind it. For a moment, I just sat there with the engine idling. Sometimes hikers lost track of time and ended up finishing a trail after closing hours. It happened occasionally, especially during the summer when people tried to squeeze in one last hike before sunset. But Cedar Ridge wasn't a short trail. If someone had started that hike late in the evening, they would still be deep in the woods by now. I looked toward the trail entrance. The forest beyond the wooden trail sign was completely dark. No flashlights, no voices, no movement. Just a narrow path disappearing into the trees. I picked up the patrol radio and glanced down at the logbook on the passenger seat. No vehicles had been reported in this area after closing, which meant one of two things. Either someone had gotten stuck out on the trail longer than they expected, or someone had come into the park after I locked the gate. And that second possibility usually meant trouble. I shut off the engine and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching quietly under my boots as the forest around me stayed completely still. I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat and walked over to the pickup first. The truck was cold when I placed my hand on the hood. Whoever owned it hadn't arrived recently. It had probably been sitting there for a while. I shined the light through the windows. The cab was empty. No movement, no one asleep inside. Just a few empty water bottles and a folded jacket on the passenger seat. I stepped back and looked toward the trailhead again. The wooden sign marked the entrance to Cedar Ridge Trail, but beyond that, the path disappeared quickly into thick trees. At night, the forest swallowed light almost immediately. Even with a good flashlight, you could only see a short distance ahead. If someone had started that hike late in the evening, they would still be deep in the woods by now. I picked up my radio to my shoulder and started walking down the trail. The gravel of the parking lot faded into packed dirt and scattered pine needles under my boots. The forest grew quieter the farther I went. The only sound was the steady rhythm of my footsteps and the faint buzz of insects somewhere deeper in the woods. After a few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. No voices, no movement. I kept walking. The beam of my flashlight moved slowly across the trees as the trail curved through the forest. Cedar Ridge wasn't heavily trafficked, but it was still a marked trail. Anyone hiking it would normally stay on the path. That's when I saw it. A small flicker of light. At first, I thought it was just a reflection. Then my headlights shifted slightly as the road curved, and I saw it clearly. Someone was definitely out there. I stepped off the trail and started moving towards it. Branches snapped softly under my boots as I pushed through the undergrowth. The beam of my flashlight bounced across tree trunks and patches of low brush while I moved slowly in the direction of the light. After about 30 yards, the smell of smoke reached me. Not a large fire, just the faint scent of something burning. A few steps later, the trees opened into a small clearing. That's when I saw the campsite. It was set up in a place that was clearly not meant for camping. No fire ring, no designated area, nothing official. Just a small tent tucked between two trees and a lantern sitting on the ground beside it. A man was crouched near a small fire that had been carefully hidden between a few rocks. He looked up the moment my flashlight hit him. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then I spoke. "Evening," I said calmly. "Park closed a while ago." The man didn't answer right away. He stood slowly and brushed dirt off his hands. The lantern light revealed a thin face and tired eyes that immediately shifted past me, scanning the trees behind where I stood. Finally, he looked back at me. "I'm just camping," he said. His voice sounded tight. I glanced around the clearing again. "This isn't a camping area, and you're about 30 yards off the trail." The man shrugged slightly, but he still kept glancing toward the darkness behind me. I didn't think it mattered. Something about the way he said it felt wrong. Not defensive, not apologetic, just uneasy. And the strange part was that he didn't seem nervous about being caught in the park after closing. He seemed nervous about something entirely else. For a moment, we just stood there in the small clearing, the lantern casting a dull yellow glow over the ground between us. I finally nodded toward the trail. "Park closes at 8, I said. "I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and head back to the trailhead with me." The man hesitated. Not the normal kind of hesitation someone gives when they know they're in trouble. This felt different. His eyes drifted past me again, briefly scanning the trees behind my shoulder before he nodded. "Yeah, okay," he said quietly. He moved quickly after that, kicking dirt over the small fire and stuffing a few loose items into a backpack beside the tent. He didn't bother taking the tent down properly. He just collapsed it halfway and shoved it under his arm like he wanted to leave as soon as possible. That alone struck me as strange. Most people argued when they were told to leave a campsite, especially if they'd already set everything up. But this guy looked like he was relieved. Within a minute, we were walking back through the trees toward the trail. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead while he walked a few steps in front of me. The forest felt even darker now that we had left the lantern behind. Branches scraped softly as we pushed back toward the main path. When we reached the trail again, I angled my light down to check the ground. The dirt path was soft enough to hold footprints, and it was standard practice to glance for tracks when you were dealing with visitors after hours. At first, everything looked normal. 2 sets of fresh prints, mine and his. Then I noticed something that made me stop walking. Another set of footprints crossed the trail about 10 feet ahead of us. They were deeper than ours, like whoever made them had been moving quickly. The prints cut across the path and continued into the woods on the opposite side, heading farther away from the trail. I lifted the flashlight and followed the direction of them. The tracks disappeared into the dark forest. "Hey," I said. The man stopped walking. I pointed the beam of my flashlight toward the prints. "You out here with someone else tonight?" He turned slowly and looked down at the ground where I was pointing. For a second, his face went completely still. Then he shook his head. "No," he said quickly. I kept the light on the tracks. "These are fresh," I said. "They crossed the trail right here." He stepped closer and looked down again. I could see his jaw tighten slightly. "I didn't see anyone." He said it carefully, like he was choosing his words. I studied the footprints again. They were larger than his boots. Whoever made them had stepped hard into the dirt, leaving deep impressions that pointed farther into the forest, away from the trail, away from the parking lot. I slowly turned my flashlight back toward the trees. The forest beyond the trail was completely black. No movement, no sound, just endless rows of pine trees standing quietly in the dark. I looked back at the man. "You're sure you came out here alone?" I asked. He nodded again, but this time it was slower. "Yeah," he said, but his eyes had already shifted past me again, back into the woods. And that was the moment I realized something that made the back of my neck tighten. He wasn't afraid of getting caught in the park after closing. He was afraid of whatever made those footprints. And if those prints were as fresh as they looked, whoever made them was probably still somewhere out there in the trees with us. Night patrol in the park usually meant long stretches of silence. Most of the time, the radio barely made a sound unless someone was checking in at the end of their shift. Rangers were spread out across different sections of the park, but at night there wasn't much for any of us to deal with. Maybe the occasional camper who stayed too late, or someone who locked their keys in their car. That night, I was parked along the edge of the northern service road, finishing up my patrol log. The truck engine was idling quietly, while the headlights lit up a patch of empty gravel ahead of me. Beyond that, the forest was completely dark. Sector 12 sat a few miles farther up the road. It was one of the more isolated areas of the park, mostly old maintenance trails and a few restricted sections where visitors weren't allowed. Another ranger named Mark was assigned to patrol that sector that night. He had checked in about an hour earlier. Everything had sounded normal. I had just finished writing the time of my last checkpoint when the radio on my shoulder crackled. At first, it was just static, a low burst of noise that faded in and out for a few seconds. Then a voice pushed through it. "Hello?" It was faint, like someone speaking from far away. I picked up the radio immediately. "Go ahead," I said. More static filled the speaker. The signal was breaking apart so badly that I could barely hear anything at all. Then the voice came back again. "Base, you copy?" It sounded like Mark. I turned the volume up and leaned closer to the radio. "Yeah, I copy. Mark, that you?" There was a pause, then another burst of static. "I've got someone." The words came through unevenly, cutting in and out between loud bursts of interference. "You've got someone where?" I asked. For a few seconds, the radio went completely silent. Then Mark's voice returned again, louder this time, but still distorted. "Been walking tree line for a while now." The signal crackled hard enough that the rest of the sentence disappeared. I sat up straighter in the seat. "Mark, say again," I said. "Your signal's breaking up." The response came almost immediately, but this time it sounded different, tighter. "Don't think they know I—" The transmission cut off completely. Just static. I waited. Nothing. "Mark?" I said into the radio. No answer. The forest around the truck felt unusually quiet all of a sudden. I tried again. "Sector 12, this is Ranger Unit 3. Do you copy?" Only static came back. I leaned back in the seat, staring out at the empty road ahead of me while the radio hissed quietly in my hand. Mark wasn't the type of person who panicked easily. He had worked night patrol longer than most of us, and Sector 12 was territory he knew well. If his voice sounded that tense over the radio, something had definitely gotten his attention. And the way he said someone had been walking along the tree line, that part didn't sit right with me. There weren't supposed to be visitors anywhere near Sector 12 after dark. I waited another minute for the radio to come back to life. It didn't. Finally, I set it down on the passenger seat and reached for the gear shift. Sector 12 was about a 15-minute drive from where I was parked. If Mark was having trouble with someone out there, the last thing he needed was to be dealing with it alone. I turned the truck around on the gravel road and started heading deeper into the park toward the sector checkpoint. The farther I drove, the weaker the radio signal became, and the entire time I kept thinking about the way his voice sounded right before the transmission cut out, like he had just realized something behind him, something he hadn't expected to see. The road to Sector 12 was narrow and uneven, more of a maintenance route than something visitors ever used. At night, it felt even more remote. My headlights swept across the trees as the truck bounced slowly along the gravel. Every few minutes, I tried the radio again, hoping Mark's signal would come back. Each time, I was met with the same empty burst of static. The farther I drove, the darker the forest seemed to get. The main roads of the park were miles behind me now. Out here, there were no campgrounds, no cabins, and no visitor trails. Just old service roads and dense forest. About 12 minutes into the drive, the road curved sharply around a bend. That's when I saw the light. Two bright beams cutting through the trees ahead. I slowed immediately. Another vehicle was parked across the road about 50 yards ahead of me. As I got closer, I recognized the shape of the Ranger truck. It was Mark's. The vehicle sat at an angle near the entrance to a locked service road that led deeper into Sector 12. The metal gate across that road was still closed, just like it should have been. But the strange part was the vehicle itself. The headlights were still on. They illuminated the metal gate and a section of the forest beyond it, casting long shadows through the trees. I pulled my vehicle to a stop behind his and shut off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there looking at the scene. Mark's driver door was slightly open. The inside cabin light glowed faintly, but there was no one inside. I stepped out of my truck and walked slowly toward the vehicle. "Mark?" I called. My voice echoed faintly against the trees. No response. The forest felt unnaturally still. I approached the open driver door and looked inside. His radio sat in the center console. His flashlight was still clipped to the dashboard mount. Even his Ranger hat was lying on the passenger seat. But Mark wasn't there. I leaned down and shined my flashlight across the ground near the truck. That's when I noticed the tracks. The dirt along the road was soft from rain earlier in the week, and the surface had been disturbed recently. Boot prints, several of them. They started near the open driver door and moved quickly across the road toward the trees. The stride between the prints was long, too long for someone casually walking. It looked like someone had been running. I followed the tracks with my flashlight beam. They crossed the gravel shoulder and disappeared into the forest just beyond the road. For a second, I stood there listening. The trees around me swayed slightly in the night breeze, making a quiet rustling sound through the branches. Otherwise, the woods were silent. I tried the radio again. "Mark, this is Unit 3, I said. "I'm at your vehicle. You out here?" Static answered back. I lowered the radio slowly and looked back at the tracks. If those were Mark's footprints, he had left his truck in a hurry, and the direction they led didn't make much sense. They weren't heading toward the main road. They were going straight into the woods, like he had been chasing someone, or running from them. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and stepped toward the tree line. The beam of light slid across the trunks as I followed the trail of footprints into the forest. After about 20 feet, I noticed something else. Another set of tracks. These ones were lighter, less clear, but they were moving in the same direction. Two people had run into the woods from this spot, and judging by the spacing of the footprints, one of them had been moving much faster than the other. The deeper I moved into the trees, the harder it became to follow the tracks. The ground was uneven and covered with layers of pine needles that hid most footprints after only a few steps. I had to keep sweeping the flashlight slowly back and forth, trying to catch the faint impressions left in the dirt whenever the ground cleared. Both sets of tracks continued in the same direction, straight into the forest. About 30 yards in, the trail started to break apart completely. The prints scattered across patches of leaves and roots, making it nearly impossible to tell exactly where they were heading. I stopped and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the soft movement of branches high above me. Then I heard it, a quick shift of movement somewhere off to my left. It was subtle, like someone stepping carefully on dry leaves. I turned the flashlight immediately. The beam cut across a row of trees and thick brush, but I didn't see anyone. "Mark?" I called quietly. No answer. I took a few steps in that direction. The forest floor sloped downward slightly, and fallen branches snapped softly under my boots as I moved. Then the sound came again, closer this time. A quick rustle followed by the unmistakable sound of someone shifting their weight. I raised the flashlight higher. "Mark?" I said again. "It's me." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice came from behind a fallen tree about 15 feet ahead of me. "Don't move." I froze. The beam of my flashlight landed on the shape of someone crouched low behind the trunk. It was Mark. His uniform was dirty, and his breathing looked heavy, like he'd been running for a long time. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward the deeper part of the forest. When he saw it was me, he slowly stood up. "Thank God," he said under his breath. "What happened?" I asked. He stepped closer, but kept his voice low. "I thought that was you earlier, but it wasn't." "What do you mean?" Mark wiped sweat from his forehead and looked back toward the darkness again. "I've been out here for almost an hour. Someone's been moving through the trees just outside my flashlight range." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Did you see them?" I asked. "Not clearly," he said. "Just movement." He pointed deeper into the woods. I'd hear footsteps or branches snapping. Then when I turned the light, nothing was there. I glanced behind him into the darkness. "Why didn't you stay with the truck?" "He tried," he said quickly. "The first time I heard them, I thought it was just an animal. But when I got back to the vehicle, I saw someone standing in the tree line across the road." "Standing?" He nodded slowly. "Just watching." The forest around us suddenly felt much larger than it had a moment ago. "Did they say anything?" "No," Mark said. "They started walking toward the truck." He swallowed hard. That's when I left the road. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then a faint crack echoed somewhere in the trees behind us. Both of us turned at the same time. The sound had come from the direction we'd just walked through. Mark lowered his voice even more. "He's still out here," he whispered. The darkness between the trees looked thicker now, like it was hiding something just beyond the reach of our lights. I slowly nodded toward the direction of the road. "We need to get back to the truck," I said. Mark didn't argue. We turned and started walking carefully through the forest together. But after only a few steps, I heard something behind us again. Footsteps, moving slowly through the trees, following us. The storm had rolled in just after sunset. By the time my shift reached the halfway point, the entire park was wrapped in a steady curtain of rain. Water streaked across the windshield of the patrol truck, while the wipers moved back and forth in a slow rhythm. Most nights, the park felt quiet. That night, it felt completely empty. Storms usually kept everyone away, And the few campers who had reserved spots earlier in the week were likely staying inside their tents or vehicles waiting for the weather to pass. My patrol route that evening took me along the Western Ridge Road, a narrow stretch of pavement that climbed through thick forest before looping back toward the ranger station. It wasn't a popular road. Most visitors never even realized it existed. About halfway along that route sat an old fire tower that hadn't been used in years. The tower stood on top of a steep hill just off the road, rising above the surrounding trees like a thin metal skeleton. Decades ago, rangers would climb it during dry seasons to watch for smoke across the forest. But the park had switched to satellite monitoring long ago. The tower had been permanently closed after that. The access door at the base had a heavy lock installed, and the staircase inside had been declared unsafe. Rangers were instructed not to enter unless maintenance crews were scheduled to repair something. As far as I knew, no one had been up there in at least 5 years. I was driving past the hill when something unusual caught my eye through the rain. At first, I thought it was lightning reflecting off the tower, but the sky was dark and steady. No flashes, just rain. Then I saw it again, a small glow near the top of the tower. I slowed the truck slightly and leaned forward toward the windshield. Through the moving rain and darkness, a faint yellow light was clearly visible in the observation room at the very top. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. The tower should have been completely dark. No electricity ran to it anymore. No equipment had been installed there in years. Yet the light was unmistakable. It flickered slightly, like the soft glow of a lantern. I pulled the truck to the side of the road and turned off the headlights. The rain continued tapping against the roof of the vehicle as I looked up toward the hill. From this angle, the tower stood above the tree line, its thin metal frame outlined against the dark sky. And at the very top, inside the glass observation room, the light was still there, moving slightly, like someone walking around inside. I sat there for a moment thinking through the possibilities. Maybe a group of hikers had somehow gotten inside the tower before the storm started. It wouldn't have been the first time someone ignored a locked structure just to explore it. But the door at the base was secured with a heavy ranger lock. Breaking into it wouldn't be easy. And if someone had done that, they were now climbing a staircase that had been declared unsafe years ago. Another possibility crossed my mind. Maintenance crews. But no one had reported work scheduled for the tower tonight. The rain began falling harder, tapping loudly against the windshield. I looked up at the faint glow one more time. The light shifted slightly again. Someone was definitely moving up there. I grabbed my flashlight from the seat and stepped out of the truck into the rain. If someone had broken into that tower during a storm, the last thing they needed was to be climbing unstable stairs in the dark. And the longer I looked at that light glowing above the trees, the more it bothered me that it was there at all. The rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately as I started up the narrow path that led toward the tower. The hill wasn't steep enough to be dangerous, but the ground had turned slick with mud from the storm. My boots slipped a few times on the way up, and I had to grab branches along the trail to steady myself. Above the trees, the dark frame of the fire tower rose into the sky, and the light was still there. Even through the rain, I could see it clearly now, a soft yellow glow shifting slowly behind the glass windows of the observation room at the top, like someone walking from one side of the room to the other. I kept climbing. The metal structure creaked faintly as the wind pushed against it. The sound carried down through the tower and mixed with the steady rainfall around me. When I reached the base of the hill, I stopped for a moment and aimed my flashlight upward. The beam didn't reach the top, but it lit up the first several flights of the spiral staircase inside the tower. Rust covered most of the metal now, and parts of the railing looked badly weathered. That staircase definitely hadn't been repaired, which made the light at the top feel even more strange. I stepped under the tower and approached the entrance door. It was a thick metal door set into the base of the structure, the same one that had been locked for years. I pointed my flashlight at the handle. The heavy ranger lock was still in place, exactly where it should be. I crouched slightly and looked closer. No scratches, no signs of forced entry. The lock hadn't been tampered with. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it while the rain dripped off the brim of my hat. Then I slowly looked back up toward the top of the tower. The lantern glow shifted across the windows at the top. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. The rain intensified, tapping loudly against the metal frame above me. For a moment, I considered calling the station to report it, but the longer I stood there looking at that moving light, the more it felt like something I needed to check immediately. If someone had gotten trapped inside somehow, climbing that unstable staircase in the middle of a storm could get them seriously hurt. I walked back around to the door and took the key ring from my belt. The metal keys jingled softly as I flipped through them until I found the tower key. I hesitated for a second. Then I slid the key into the lock. With a heavy metallic click, the old mechanism turned. The door slowly creaked open, and somewhere far above me inside the tower, the light stopped moving. The inside of the tower smelt like wet metal and old wood. Rain tapped steadily against the structure above me, echoing faintly down the hollow shaft of the staircase. The spiral steps wound upward in tight circles, disappearing into darkness after only a few turns. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there listening. The storm outside sounded distant now, muffled by the walls of the tower. Inside, the only clear sound was the faint creaking of the metal frame shifting in the wind. Then, I noticed something else. A soft glow coming from far above. The lantern light filtered down through the open center of the spiral staircase, casting faint shadows across the steps. Someone was definitely up there. I lifted my flashlight and aimed it upward. The beam only reached a few levels before fading into the dim yellow glow above. "Park Ranger," I called out. My voice echoed up the tower. "If someone's up there, I need you to come down slowly." No response. I waited a few seconds. Still nothing. So I placed my hand on the railing and started climbing. The metal steps groaned quietly under my boots as I moved upward. Each step echoed through the tower, making it impossible to move silently. About halfway up the tower, I heard the sound again. This time, it was clearer. A quiet footstep above my head. I froze. My flashlight beam trembled slightly as I aimed it upward. "Sir, you're not supposed to be in this tower." For a moment, there was no response. Then, something unexpected happened. A voice drifted down from somewhere near the top of the staircase. Quiet, barely louder than a whisper. "Who's down there?" The words sent a chill through me, not because of what they said, but because of how they sounded. The voice didn't carry the tone of someone surprised to see a ranger. It sounded cautious, almost nervous, like the person upstairs didn't expect anyone else inside the tower either. "I'm Park Ranger Patrol. I need you to come down slowly." There was a long pause above me. I waited for the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Instead, the lantern light shifted slightly, and I heard something move across the floor of the observation room, away from the staircase. I frowned and started climbing again. If someone was trying to hide up there, the tower didn't have many places to go. Within another minute, I reached the final stretch of stairs. The lantern glow now filled the entire upper section of the tower. I could see the doorway leading into the observation room just a few steps above me. I tightened my grip on the railing and climbed the last few steps. fully expecting to confront whoever had been speaking from the top of the tower. I stepped into the observation room expecting someone to be standing there, but the room was empty. The lantern sat on the wooden floor in the center of the room, its small flame flickering behind the glass and casting long shadows across the walls. For a few seconds, I just stood in the doorway, trying to understand what I was looking at. The observation room wasn't large, maybe 10 feet across on each side, surrounded by tall windows that looked out over the dark forest below. There were no closets, no storage spaces, nowhere a person could hide. And yet, someone had clearly been up here. I stepped fully into the room and swept my flashlight across the corners just to be sure. Nothing. Just dust, old equipment brackets on the walls, and the lantern glowing quietly on the floor. I walked over to the windows and looked out into the storm. Rain streaked across the glass while the wind pushed through the trees far below. From this height, the forest stretched out in every direction like a dark ocean of branches. No lights, no movement. I turned back toward the staircase. The narrow doorway I had just climbed through was the only entrance into the observation room. The spiral stairs dropped straight down the center of the tower. There was no second exit, no ladder, no hatch. No way anyone could have left without passing me on those stairs. And I would have heard them. The entire structure echoed with every step. I slowly walked back toward the lantern. Up close, it looked older than I expected. The metal frame was worn and slightly rusted in places, but the flame inside burned steadily like it had been lit only a short time ago. I crouched beside it. The warmth of the flame brushed lightly against my hand. Someone had carried this up here, and only minutes earlier I had heard a voice from this exact room asking who was downstairs. The memory of that whisper suddenly made the room feel colder. I stood up and looked around one more time. Still nothing. Eventually, I picked up the lantern and started back down the staircase. The climb down felt longer than the climb up. Every creak of the metal steps echoed through the tower, and more than once I caught myself glancing upward behind me, even though I knew the room above was empty. When I reached the bottom, the rain was still falling steadily outside. I stepped out of the tower and locked the door again, sliding the heavy lock back into place. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the storm and looking up at the dark structure above me. The observation room windows were black now. No light, no movement, just the faint outline of the tower against the cloudy sky. I carried the lantern back to the truck and placed it on the passenger seat before driving back toward the ranger station. Later that night, I brought it inside and set it on the front desk. One of the other rangers walked over and looked at it. "Where'd you find that?" he asked. "In the fire tower," I said. He frowned slightly and picked it up, turning it in his hands. Then he shook his head. "That's not ours," he said. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He pointed to a small engraving stamped into the metal near the base of the lantern, a manufacturer's mark. Then he said something that made the entire night feel even stranger. "We've never used lanterns in that tower," he said. He set it back down on the desk. "That thing didn't come from the park.